I used to feel very overwhelmed a lot of times because far away from my family, far away from my loved ones, pressure of studies. One of my friends at that time, in fact, my girlfriend at that time, and my wife now, she recommended to me that I should sit in the grass for some time. To my surprise, within 15, 20, 25 minutes, a lot of the stress would just go away. Human beings want to grow. Most people are usually very reasonable, they are good people, they want to grow, they are motivated. Giving very, very direct critical feedback to someone most of the time doesn't work. So, my philosophy is usually 80% encouragement and 20% nudges and pushback. There's one mental skill I always recommend to athletes as well as employees, and that's scanning. Lionel Messi, who is probably one of the greatest footballers of all time, he scans the football field almost 3 times more compared to other international athletes.
Welcome to the All-Star Athlete Podcast, your guide to mastering the mental game and reaching your full potential. Welcome everyone to the All-Star Athlete Podcast. Today we have with us a very special guest, a dear friend of mine, Gagandeep Singh, who is a colleague of mine from grad school, who is now living in India and has started a mental performance company of his own. I'd like to formally welcome to the show Gagandeep Singh. Gagandeep, if you could please briefly introduce yourself for our listeners and let us know a little bit about you.
Sure, thank you, Justin. Thank you for having me. It's an absolute honor for me to be here. My name is Gagandeep Singh. I am a psychologist and a leadership coach from India, and I primarily work with engineers on people skills. So I help engineers become better leaders. I help them with people skills around client communication and productivity. And I have my own company called Hello Excellence Consulting.
Wonderful. Welcome to the show. We're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Justin.
So before we actually dive into mental performance and leadership, though, I'd love to hear something a little bit more personal about you, which is kind of a segment that I like to do at the beginning of the show, a little icebreaker, get to know you kind of a thing, because we're all human here too, right? So we want to highlight that. And I recall back from grad school, actually, a story that you used to tell me, which was a piece of advice that you've actually given me in the past. And that is, one of your favorite practices is to encourage people to just sit outside in the grass, which sounds very basic, but I'm wondering if you could share a personal story about sitting outside in the grass, why that's so meaningful to you, and what it does for your mind or for your performance.
Sure, absolutely, Justin. I'd be happy to share. So when I was studying in the US, and you and I, we were both in the grad school, I remember I used to feel very overwhelmed a lot of times because far away from my family, far away from my loved ones, pressure of studies, and I always wanted to do good in my grad school. So a lot of times I would feel overwhelmed. A couple of times I had panic attacks, and one of my friends at that time, in fact, my girlfriend at that time, and my wife now, she recommended to me that I should sit in the grass for some time, and she said that it will really help me get some grounding. So initially I thought it's some mumbo jumbo, but I went outside. I started sitting in the grass, and to my surprise, within 15, 20, 25 minutes, a lot of the stress would just go away and it would vanish. Now, I'm not saying sitting in the grass is a substitute for professional help, but I realized that when I was stressed out, just sitting in the grass for some time would really positively affect my emotions. And then I went and did some research of my own, and I started reading books on this. I started reading journals and research articles on this, and I found that it's actually grounding. It's a grounding technique, and uh, primarily our body is made for a certain type of environment which we often don't provide to it, which is outside, natural grass, fresh air, sunlight. And if we go back to that sort of environment, we feel better. Our body feels more at peace, feels more at home. So I started doing some research, and then I found that research also says that if we just sit in the grass for 20 minutes every day for 3 weeks, 70% of our stress levels go down in that amount of time. So I recommend that technique to everyone now.
Wonderful. Well, it sounds like your wife is a very wise woman, and I think we would all do well to, kind of take that as it is, right? And they say, "Happy wife, happy life," and
Yeah.
you know, these women tend to be very wise, regardless of whether we think what they're saying is mumbo jumbo or not, right? And that's actually funny because I thought that that was a piece of advice coming from you, which it was from you to me, but I didn't know actually until just now that it had come from your wife or girlfriend at the time. So thank you for sharing that story with us.
Most welcome, Justin.
So now that we know about that a little bit, as far as right your mental performance controlling techniques, right, stress management, anxiety management, these are all different sort of subsects of mental performance. And I'm wondering, right, you have a background maybe not in psychology or mental performance coaching. I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners a little bit about your journey into mental performance coaching and what sort of inspired you to work with both athletes and executives or people within the business industry.
Sure, Justin. So since my childhood, I used to be pretty good at physics and math, and I always loved helping people. I loved playing sports. And as I grew up, most of my friends, like a lot of Indians do, I went for engineering because I was pretty good at physics, I was pretty good at math. I was able to clear some exams, so I became an engineer. And once I graduated from my bachelor's, I started working with Ericsson. It's a big network telecom company, and during that time, I realized that the success of the organization was coming through people, and the policies that the company had created, the way they implemented, the way the teams were structured, the people interacted with each other. So got curious about that, and I said, okay, let me add an element of psychological knowledge on top of this, and I thought that I'll go into the field of HR. So a lot of my friends, again, just peer pressure, were going for an MBA. I decided to go for an MBA in HR, and I went to my grad school, did my MBA in HR, graduated, started working as an HR manager with a company called Reliance, which is India's biggest oil and gas company. And during that time, a lot of people came to me with concerns around their mental health, a lot of them struggling with stress, a lot of them struggling with relationships. And I realized that I did not have the tools to help them. As an HR manager, oftentimes my knowledge would be limited to the policies that the company had. So I felt very handicapped. So I thought, okay, let me add another element of psychological knowledge. I need to upskill myself. So I decided to pursue another master's in sports psychology. Of course, I chose sports psychology because I always loved sports. So I came to the US, started studying sports psychology, and the funny thing is, in the first semester itself, uh, one of my professors started talking about sports sociology and how sports had a great impact on the society. And I often used to think that I'm learning all of these tools and techniques. How do I give back? How do I give back to the people in society, and how do I help them? And which somehow shifted my focus back towards corporate HR. So during my time there in the US, I realized that most people are not athletes. Most people are average 9 to 5 working sort of people. So how can I make a wider impact? So I decided that once I learn all these skills around mental performance, uh, gain my deeper knowledge around counseling techniques, how to focus better, how to manage time, how to manage stress. Once I am done learning, I would like to go back and work more with corporate professionals, and that's because it's a wider audience, and I felt I could have a more significant impact. So that, and of course, because I was an engineer and an HR manager, so it was easier for me to build on top of that knowledge, and I had experience of working with Fortune 500 companies. So that's why I decided to become a mental performance consultant, typically for engineers and corporate professionals. So that's a sedimentation of my career decisions.
Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that. I think it's a very astute observation that more, I mean, it sounds very basic at surface level, but it's actually not something that I've really thought about. And I'll kind of highlight what you said in that most people are not athletes, which is true, right? Athletes tend to be sensationalized and glamorized, and we see them more, right, on social media, on TV, everywhere, right? Athletes are kind of the pinnacle of performance, right? But that doesn't mean that they're the only people that need performance coaching, nor are they the widest audience potentially for performance coaching. So it seems like you realized that and combined that with your background of kind of working as an engineer and in HR and sort of applied that same sport and exercise psychology, we'll call it, or mental performance coaching to a different audience.
Yep.
So go ahead. Did you have something else to kind of add on there?
No, you're absolutely right. I realized that the techniques that were being taught to us were relevant for all people. The techniques that athletes use for managing stress, the same techniques can be applied at workplace, in our personal relationships. The techniques that were being taught to us around counseling and building connection with people could be applied to corporate relationships as well. So, in fact, the way athletes enhance their focus using pre-performance routines, which is such a technical thing, even the same tool can be used in our day-to-day life. Before we open our laptop and start working, having a pre-performance routine is such a powerful uh, motivator, and it enhances focus. So yes, I totally agree that it's not just limited to athletes, it's performance psychology, and everyone can make the most out of it.
Okay, and to that point, we both know that there's a lot of similarities between athletes, particularly high performing athletes, and high performing executives or engineers or anybody in sort of the corporate business entrepreneurial world, right? But it's not a parallel that a lot of people draw. But we know that there's a lot of similarities between the two. So to that point, how would you describe specifically the similarities and differences in coaching athletes versus coaching professionals in high pressure corporate or tech environments?
Maybe I can start with the differences because we've talked about similarities a bit.
Sure.
And I think most of the techniques are easily replicable across industries, across professions. But there's a very beautiful difference between coaching athletes and between coaching individuals, is that in sports there's always a scorecard which is giving us constant feedback about how we are performing. So let's say if we're playing soccer, we know if we are 1-0 down or 2-0 down or 3-0 down or 5-0 down, we know that we are doing a bad job. In organizations, though, it's not exactly like that. Organizations have their performance reviews annually, so people usually get feedback 1 year after they've already performed. And usually, most managers, just like all other human beings, they are conflict avoidant. They don't want to have difficult conversations. So people don't easily get that feedback, especially constructive feedback from their managers, because it's a very uncomfortable conversation between two people. So in sports, in a match, you know how bad you're performing because the scorecard says it, and you can immediately rectify your mistakes, come up with some strategies, and tweak your way. But in corporate workplaces, it's much harder, and at the end of the year, a lot of times people get shocks, and they think they've been performing really well, and sometimes managers don't rate them well. Conversely, sometimes they feel they are not doing a good job, but managers rate them well. So that scorecard is missing.
Okay, so you're saying one of the biggest differences is that athletes tend to get more immediate feedback, whether it's good or bad, about what their performance is, whereas people in the corporate sort of entrepreneurial business workspace aren't really getting that feedback as quickly, and that can make performance adjusting your performance levels more challenging because you're not getting that feedback. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. People have the lead time of blind spots is pretty high in corporate, is what I would say.
Okay. So does that sort of influence or inform your approach to coaching?
It's a very good question, Justin. In a in a corporate setup, what I have realized is that unlike sports, the the lead time is also very high in terms of professional growth. So an athlete usually, if they are like really really good at an international level, they'll have 5 10 years of a career if they're really really good. On the other hand, an average corporate professional usually works for 30, 35, 40 years. So which means their growth is spread out. And therefore a lot of times you would see that people are growing, but their growth is very linear and very slow. A lot of people stagnate, they stay in their comfort zones, they reach a certain level which could be a mid level management level, and then they stagnate. Sports on the other hand, people can't do that. They have to quickly adapt, they have to quickly change themselves, and if they don't do that, they lose the next match. So the lead time in growth is also very very high in in corporates compared to sports, and therefore it's a bit challenging when it comes to coaching.
Okay, so to that point, do you have any core principles that guide your approach to performance and leadership?
So there's something that I have realized after working with very senior professionals from companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Tesla, Microsoft, is that human beings want to grow. Most people are usually very reasonable, they are good people, they want to grow, they are motivated. It's just that giving very, very direct critical feedback to someone most of the time doesn't work. And human beings have their comfort zones, they have their egos. So a good way to grow, or a good way to coach someone, is to mix nudges with with a lot of encouragement. So my philosophy is usually 80% encouragement and 20% nudges and pushback. And anything outside of that ratio, it really backfires. So if I am too critical, let's say as a coach, and I push my client too much, and I focus too much on the areas they need to improve upon, usually they start resisting me. And if I go the other way, if I'm overly appreciative all the time, if I appreciate their identity more than their actions, then also people get too much casual, and they stick to their comfort zones. So I think the ratio that I use is 80% encouragement. You give them a lot of validation, you encourage them, you appreciate them, you look at their strengths, you look at the goodness in them, and 20% is that pushback and nudge towards improvement. And that 80% has to come first, by the way. So encouragement first, pushback later.
Okay, so you're saying that basically positive reinforcement rather than negative reinforcement tends to sit better with most individuals. because most people want to learn and grow, but most people, you're saying, in your experience, don't really react as effectively to sort of negative feedback. Is that, or constructive criticism, or whatever you want to call it? Is that true?
Yeah, so think of it like this. Have you ever seen a railway crossing? There's this barrier that goes up and down. So think of human beings like a barrier. So that barrier only opens when the person in front of you believes that you are on their side, you want them to grow, and you are there to support them. You're not a competitor, you're not an enemy, and you're on their side. And that only happens through encouragement. So when we see the goodness in people, and it's legitimate appreciation, it's not fake appreciation, it's when I see the goodness in someone and I point it out and I acknowledge it, that's when that barrier opens. Once that barrier opens, I can go ahead and influence them. And I wouldn't say people are very rejecting of feedback. It's just that sometimes that critical feedback is given before that barrier is open.
Right, and that causes people to be maybe a little bit more defensive or resistant to change because they feel like you're not giving them that feedback in their best interest.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about specific mental skills, right? So that was kind of a little bit about your approach to coaching, but
Yep.
specifically the mental skills that we might see athletes or engineers using, right? So in your experience as a coach or consultant, what mental skills are the most critical for high performing individuals, whether it's in sports or in business? Or if there's a difference, maybe speak to that.
Oh, I think it's the same. There's one mental skill I always recommend to athletes as well as employees, and that's scanning. So, for those of our viewers who know soccer, you would know that every international player or every elite athlete, while playing soccer, they spend most of their time turning their head left and right even before they receive the ball, just scanning the spaces where the ball is, where the defenders are, where the attackers are, and it's a beautiful technique that all of these athletes use. In fact, there is a statistic that says Lionel Messi, who is probably one of the greatest footballers of all time, he scans the football field almost three times more compared to other international athletes. So he's just looking around and he's moving his head like this all the time. And that gives him that extra bit of information. And when he receives the ball, then it's up to his skill, and then he makes a pass or shoots or dribbles. But that scanning, that's the critical bit. In organizations as well, I always encourage people to scan more. Most of the times we are always in our head. We are thinking about our goals, our ambitions, our promotions, our increments, our salary hikes, and we get so lost in our own feelings and our own goals that we stop scanning the outside world. And most of the things in the real world happen through relationships, and human beings have patterns. You can observe, you can predict, but because we are not scanning, we are so wrapped up in our own head that we forget to observe other people, and then we are not able to influence them. So in fact, just yesterday, one of my mentees reached out to me, and they had their first day at their job, and they said, Gagan, what should I say? I said, you don't say anything, don't talk about yourself. On your first day, ask questions from your manager. What is it that's most important to you? What's your priority for the next 6 months? How can I be successful in this role? What are some things that you don't want me to do? What are some things you want me to do? How should I apply for a leave? What's the right way? So ask them questions about them and forget yourself for at least 1 month, and just try to understand what their psyches, what their expectations are. So once you figure out what your important stakeholders want, how their patterns are, how their habits are built, then you can navigate your way much more easily. And I think that's a skill that I always recommend to athletes as well as corporate professionals.
Okay, so you're saying effectively scanning is about information gathering, basically. If I boiled it down into one sentence, it's information gathering. Is that true?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the technical definition of empathy as well. Empathy is stepping into someone else's shoes and seeing world from their perspective. And once we start observing people, how they behave, where their behaviors are coming from, we don't have to be soft. I never recommend being too soft while being empathic. Empathy for me means being able to collect that information so that you are able to see what that person is thinking, and then you can take the right action accordingly. So absolutely what you said, that it's about information gathering, and smart people do that.
Okay, so in the case of maybe an engineer or an HR executive, rather than kind of just staying in their own lane and doing their job and not really paying attention to anything else, they're scanning, right? The infrastructure of the company, they're learning about their coworkers, they're developing new skills, they're kind of looking at what other businesses outside of their business are doing, right? So it can be on a sort of a micro scale, scanning their own behavior, kind of self-reflection. So scanning means a lot of different things, I think, right?
Yes, so in this context, I would mean gathering information about others. Now, this phenomena is very prominent in engineers, because a lot of engineers, not all of them, but a lot of engineers go into engineering because they like to solve problems. They are good at analytical thinking. They are good at understanding machines. A lot of them are introverted, so they just want to sit behind a laptop and fix the code. And what they don't realize is that fixing a code will not fix the feeling of the manager. So what I recommend is, yes, you need to be technically sound. That's a hygiene factor. You cannot live without that in today's world. But a lot of time needs to be spent scanning, looking at people, talking to them, trying to understand their backgrounds, families, what their motivations are, what their triggers are, just interacting, having small talks with them. And that's something that engineers love to avoid. They would rather fix the code, they will double down on their technical skills instead of going to that colleague and having a difficult conversation, or even appreciating them. So that becomes very prominent in engineers, the lack of scanning.
Okay, and if what I'm understanding is correct, you're suggesting that for individuals who maybe don't do any scanning or very little of it, utilizing that skill is going to be critical for them to maybe elevate their performance.
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. And quickly, sort of on topic, but going back to a few minutes ago, what you said about Lionel Messi, just because I would like to know, and perhaps our listeners would like to know, where do you stand on the debate between Cristiano Ronaldo and Lionel Messi in terms of the greatest of all time?
Oh, I would not be the right person to comment on that, because I'm not a professional soccer player. So I think it just depends on what the definition of better is. For some people, having the personality of Cristiano Ronaldo would mean better. For some people, it could probably be the humility of Lionel Messi. So it just depends on what the definition of better is. Technically, I am not qualified to comment who's better in terms of playing. I like both of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
In fact, it's
Well,
very interesting. I go to inspiration to each of them in different situations. So let's say when I want to feel super confident, let's say I'm going into a sales call and I want to feel super confident, I would look up to Ronaldo and maybe draw some inspiration from there. Or when I feel I'm being overconfident and I'm giving a training session and I need a bit of humility, I would draw my inspiration from Lionel Messi. So it just depends on what I'm looking for and what other people are looking for. I think that's what the debate is also about. It's different people prioritizing different things and values in both the players.
Okay. Interesting answer, even though you didn't quite give us an answer one way or the other, which is fine. I did like how you suggested that we can derive different inspiration from different athletes. I think that's a really great point that I wasn't trying to make, but thank you for saying that, because different people do have different strengths. We all have different strengths. So I like how you said that Cristiano Ronaldo might be a little bit more confident, perhaps overconfident, perhaps cocky, depending on who you talk to about, demeanor. Because I'm sure Lionel Messi is also confident, but for example, when you were talking about that, I knew that you were going to say that that was Ronaldo because that's kind of what his personality is known as. Whereas Lionel Messi is a little bit has a little bit more humility, like you were saying. He's a little bit quieter. He's not quite so boisterous. He kind of just goes about his business. Obviously, both all-time greats, but for different reasons.
Yes, and I also feel that what we see on the screen is not usually people's real self. People at that level have a lot of media training. So they know what to say, what not to say. They are guided by professionals on how to focus more on some of their attributes and focus less on some others. So I'm sure Lionel Messi would be equally proud and confident as Ronaldo, but we actually don't know what kind of human beings they are. Sometimes it comes out on the football field, sometimes it doesn't. But for celebrities, I don't usually go by face value. People are very different compared to what they are on the screens.
Okay. Now, speaking about top level athletes and, things coming out during important matches and so forth, performance under pressure is a challenge for both athletes and executives or engineers, right? I like to think that for those of us that work in a corporate setting, we're all performing, right? Whether we're an athlete or we're someone at a company, like we're performing for someone, whether it's a client or for our boss, right? What strategies do you teach your coaching clients to stay calm, focused, and effective in potentially high stakes situations?
There are many. I'm just thinking which one should I talk about, because there are techniques for enhancing focus under high pressure situations. There are techniques for managing stress. There are techniques for dealing with uncertainty, mental rehearsals. So I'm just wondering which one should I bring up. But I think the best framework, in fact, I'm not going to use a tool right now. Let me talk more about the framework of Anders Ericsson, the 10,000 hour rule of deliberate practice. I feel the confidence to perform under pressure is built up over time, and that confidence is built up over time through practice and rehearsals. And for me, the best tool for staying calm under pressure is reducing uncertainty, because it's the uncertainty of a situation which drives stress, which drives lack of calmness. So, how do we reduce uncertainty? Well, there is visualization that you can use for reducing uncertainty. There are many other tools, but my favorite one is rehearsals. So, when we are coaching executives, also, let's say we are coaching engineers on how to speak to their clients, or how to handle objections, or how to handle crisis situations, or how to give feedback. I think the best tool is actual rehearsal of that specific conversation at least 100 times, so that when they walk into that high stakes meeting, they are not as stressed as their competitor would be. So I think rehearsals, actual rehearsals, is my go-to thing. But if you're talking about mental tools, then I would say breathing is very, very powerful as a pre-performance routine. So just doing 2 to 3 minutes of deep breathing it really significantly dips the stress levels in people. So breathing would be my go-to mental skill.
Okay, so you would say kind of two things to recap what you just said. The first tool being rehearsal. And when you say rehearsal, do you mean like physically, like dictating to yourself in front of a mirror, like by yourself, or are we rehearsing like together? Is it just an individual thing? Could you clarify that a little bit more?
As real as it can get. So, for example, let's say, and I'll give you an example. Let's say I have to go to a conference tomorrow and I have to meet potential clients. The first question a person would ask me is, "Hey Gagan, what do you do?" Now, if I start thinking at that time and I say, I am a psychologist and I work with the engineers and I deliver programs on people skills and behavioral skills, it doesn't come out really well. So a good rehearsal would be sitting in front of a person and rehearsing. So let's say I sit in front of my wife and I ask her to shoot that question, and I'll practice the answer. So first I'll write down the answer, then I'll practice in front of her. But let's say if someone else is not there, then rehearsing in front of the mirror. I have my answers rehearsed all the time. So I think an actual rehearsal would as real as it can get, so that there is no uncertainty when that situation actually happens.
So in this case, you're effectively talking about like an elevator pitch, like a 30-second answer to a common question that you might be asked, such that when you get asked that question, you're already ready for it, so you're not kind of like bumbling along. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, and I think 30 seconds is too much. 10 to 15 seconds max.
Okay.
Because people get bored and it's very narcissistic to talk about oneself too much.
Okay, for sure. So in the case of that specific question, but on a larger scale, you're talking about rehearsing. Could be a presentation that you're going to give to a board meeting type of a thing. It could be, if you're an athlete, it could be rehearsing how you're going to shoot your penalty kick in the case of a soccer match. You're actively rehearsing this over and over and over again, whether it's imagery, visualization, or physically, so that, and trying to replicate the scenario as much as possible, including trying to have, perhaps at practice, bringing additional fans or people yelling or distractions, so that when you actually have to do that in the real world, it's as close to the same thing that you've already practiced. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay, and then the second tool that you mentioned earlier was just breathing techniques. So there's a whole bunch of different breathing techniques.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to get into any of them specifically, but just taking some deep breaths, for example, activating the parasympathetic nervous system before you have to do something, high stakes or stressful, will kind of help calm you down. Is that right?
Yes. So I know there are many different types of breathing techniques. There is box breathing. There is 4-4 technique. But the one that I use is the simplest one, because even counting the seconds in my head. So I'm talking about myself. If I try to use box breathing, just counting the seconds in my head can increase stress. So the way I use breathing technique is I just take long deep breaths. So I inhale for as long as possible, then I hold my breath for as long as possible, then I exhale for as long as possible, and then I again inhale, hold, then I hold again for as long as possible. So I don't have to think too much. I am just deep breathing and I do 2 or 3 deep breaths and I feel much calmer. Yeah.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about leadership now. So leadership is often approached differently in sports versus corporate settings, or perhaps you might think it's approached the same way. But with respect to leadership, how do you help athletes, or in your case, more specifically engineers, how do you help them develop effective leadership skills?
That's a great question, Justin. I would always begin by talking about the evolutionary roots of leadership. and how human beings are typically social creatures. We are herd animals, and herd animals typically have a leader who would pave way and set the direction for most of the people behind them. I think it's not very different when it comes to human beings. There are some nuances, but I feel usually leaders are those people who have relatively clear direction of where they want to take their team, their company, their project, and they may not still know the exact plan of action, but they have a good idea of what the direction is. And then they are a very good combination of masculine and feminine energies, and this is a concept that I always teach them at the beginning. So you know how kids, all of us, most of us, most lucky kids usually have two parents. So one parent would be typically very very nurturing, caring, empathic, kind. A lot of times it's our mothers, sometimes it can be fathers too. And then the other parent would be a bit more challenging. They would push the kid to go out, learn skills, and learn how to survive. So for a human kid to grow to their peak potential, usually both feminine energy and masculine energy is needed. Feminine energy is more empathic, masculine energy is more competitive, and you cycle between these two. So when you have a kid, you first give them a lot of safety. Once they feel safe, you teach them survival skills, you ask them to go out, interact with people. Sometimes they'll have good experiences, bad experiences, sometimes even traumas. They come back with those experiences, then again you provide them safety, then again you send them back. So this cycle goes on for 18-20 years before a healthy adult is good enough to survive in the outside world. So you need a healthy mix of both masculine and feminine. A leader in an organization has to do exactly the same. An employee needs to be cared for, needs to be nurtured, needs to be loved, and once they feel safe, then they also need to be pushed. Now the problem is most leaders are either too nice or they are too authoritative, and it doesn't work in both the cases. You need a healthy mix of both, and it's a genuine problem because it's not easy to switch between our roles, right? At home you have two parents who can be themselves, but at workplace, if I am a manager and let's say I'm very nice and I'm caring, sometimes it'll be really hard for me to be assertive, because if it's not my personality to be assertive and to put my foot down, it becomes a challenge. So I think that's something that I always train my managers on, that you'll have to learn to switch between your leadership styles, and that comes through practice.
Okay, so that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier in the episode about kind of needing that 80% nurturing and 20% pushing or nudging, like you were saying. It's kind of that yin and yang, maybe not 50-50, but kind of the same idea, right?
Yep. Yes. And I think one of the most common things, in fact, the most common problem that managers bring to me is that most managers are not able to be assertive in front of their team members. Most of them. I'm not saying every one of them, but most of them. And usually people are conflict avoidant because biologically we are a conflict avoidant species. That's how we've survived for millions of years. By avoiding conflicts, by building relationships, by staying together in the herd. So biologically, most people are conflict avoidant. So when it comes to being assertive, people struggle a lot. And I think that's the most common thing that I face when managers come to me.
And you can teach that?
Just like any other skill, it's practice.
Okay. Are there specific things that you're telling these people to perhaps, because let's say I'm a listener listening to this podcast and I am very empathetic and I want to be a leader and I don't know how to confidently assert myself without pushing people away or stepping on their toes. How do I find that balance? Do you teach this skill? Like, how do you teach this?
Rehearsals. In fact, so rehearsals is one thing. You can sit down with a coach and do rehearsals. But I would say in order to develop that skill, start practicing it everywhere. and focus on one skill at a time. So, excuse me. So let's say someone wants to develop the skill of assertiveness. Then I would recommend them to not practice on any other skill for a whole month, just assertiveness, and then practice it everywhere you go. So you're talking to someone downstairs, try to practice some assertiveness. Try to put people in a bit of an uncomfortable situation. Talk confidently, look people in the eyes. So it's not just professional settings. When you're talking to your loved ones, then try to be assertive there. If you're talking to a shopkeeper outside, and practice that even if it's not right sometimes. It's okay to practice it. Even if the situation doesn't demand it, I recommend them to practice it because it's the reps that get you the results. So sometimes what I would do is, let's say if I am practicing assertiveness, sometimes I would be overly assertive to someone who probably doesn't even need it, but that's the price I pay for my practice. Everything comes at a cost. So it's, you do it with everyone, you do it for a month, and you do it at multiple touch points. Then within a month or two, you will see that you'll start gaining that confidence. One very interesting thing about human beings is that each human being, there is nurture and there is nature and nurture, right? So in fact all individuals are born with certain set of qualities. Some people are extroverted, some people are introverted from birth. So you can learn all the skills you can. It's just that what your core skills are from birth, it will be easier for you to work on them. So if I am extroverted by nature, it's easier for me to practice public speaking. But if someone is introverted, it will be harder for them. So it just depends on what your core skills are by birth, but everything can be learned and you can build on top of that. So I hope I'm able to articulate it properly.
Okay, yes, that does make sense. Thank you for clarifying. I think it goes back to kind of the rehearsal that we were talking about earlier. So leadership skills, like anything else, can be rehearsed and practiced depending on what skill you need to develop. And you were basically just saying use those assertiveness skills in all of your interactions, not just at work, and you'll get better at doing that.
Yes, and I have two nieces, and one of them is very very strong as a leader. She's born with those skills. So for her, it will be very easy to practice that assertiveness because some people are genuinely born leaders. So for them, it's easier to develop those leadership skills because that's how God made them. Some people are not, but that doesn't mean they can't learn it. Every skill is learnable. It's just that this person will have to practice it more. It will take more time, but they will be able to build on top of it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about communication now, because that ties into exactly what we were talking about with the rehearsal and the assertiveness and the empathy, right? Communication is critical for everybody, but really, for any high performing team, which most businesses comprise some sort of a team or an organization, right? So how do mental performance techniques influence the way leaders and team members communicate?
Oh, you remember, Justin, we had a course together on motivational interviewing,
I do.
and there were 3 or 4 techniques that were taught to us in that course, which was OARS framework, which was open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. So when you and I we were doing that course together, I remember we were taught those techniques. But when I started applying them in corporate environments, I realized they are more powerful than we were taught. So they are extremely powerful, and one of the things that I have learned is that reflection and validation is probably the most powerful communication technique for any human being. If you're talking about influence, if you're talking about relationship, if you're talking about rapport building, reflection and validation are the most two powerful uh, mental performance skills that can be used. and I did not realize how they were linked to dark psychology and influence before I started working with senior leaders. And what I realized was that when someone is saying something and you just reflect back to them what they were saying in your own words, people really like that because they feel heard, they feel understood, they feel important, and feeling important, feeling valued, feeling worthy is one of the most important human needs. This part was not taught to us, that why we need to reflect. It was taught to us that we need to reflect, but how it massages the ego and how people really feel understood, or maybe it was taught, I don't remember, but how it massages the ego of the other person and they feel important. That's really, really powerful. And when it comes to working with senior professionals who are CXOs, board members, you can't go in there challenging their opinion. You have to first validate, you have to encourage, you have to reflect a lot. Then then that barrier opens up, and then you can influence them. So I think motivational interviewing is probably one of the best courses that we did. And I was thinking about writing an email to Dr. Lee and our professor who taught us motivational interviewing. And it really helps me now.
Yeah, I think I took that class with Laura Curtis, and
Yep. Mm-hmm.
the book was written by she and Dawn Clifford, I think.
Yeah.
Perhaps I'll drop a link to the motivational interviewing book in the notes for this episode, because it was quite a transformative class for sure. I think it was maybe a 1 or a 2 unit class, so it was probably articulated to us the importance of affirmations and reflections and summaries and so forth, but perhaps we didn't have quite the amount of time to get into like the depth of the psychological impact of those things.
Yeah.
But you're absolutely right. And I use those techniques every day in my job as a personal trainer, as a mental performance coach. Even during just this episode of this
Yes.
podcast,
Yeah.
I've been reflecting and summarizing the things that you've been saying, which gives you an opportunity to clarify or maybe disagree with what I said if I didn't hear what you said correctly. It's just a great overall way to communicate more effectively, no matter what the situation is, because it makes sure that parties feel heard, and it also helps to eliminate or certainly reduce any miscommunication, which is often the root of conflict in any kind of environment, whether it's a workplace, business, or a team.
Absolutely. I was going to say that you've been reflecting really beautifully throughout this whole episode, and it makes me feel heard and it makes me feel important. And I think that's one of the most basic human needs. And I feel that need is getting satisfied when I'm talking to you.
Well, I appreciate that. And likewise, as we've had a long relationship, and I really appreciate the listening that you've done to me over the past, as I've experienced my fair share of anxiety and panic and things that I've come to talk to you about, and often have expressed to you that I think that you are wise. And so I think that that's why we have such a good relationship together. And the same could be true for anyone that wants to have a good relationship with another person, whether it's a teammate, whether it's a manager, whether it's a significant other, like that, these basic communication skills that we're talking about, which again, to reiterate, OARS, open-ended questions, affirmations, reflections, and summaries. And we won't necessarily define all of those terms right now, but again, you could check out the concept of motivational interviewing to find out more about those topics.
And I think if we add validation to it, I don't know if reflection counts as a validation, but just agreeing with someone's opinion, that also is very powerful. So if we can add validation to those OARS, people can become unstoppable in their relationships just by using validation. There was this very interesting workshop that I had delivered once for another company, an international company, and the audience was a mix of US, Singapore, and I think some people from India. And the topic was not something that I have expertise in. I think the topic was around diversity, equity, inclusion, and that's not something that I have very deep expertise in. But I had to deliver this session once, and I went up to my wife, and I had already done 15-20 rehearsals of the workshop beforehand. And I said I still don't feel confident. And she said, you don't have to feel confident, just validate what the other people are saying and ask questions in the workshop. You don't need any knowledge to be a good facilitator, and that's a very very powerful statement, because as trainers we need to be very competent in what we are talking about. And she said, for this specific workshop, do not count on your technical competence, just ask people questions, just validate, just reflect, and just let it be. And I said, okay, I'll try that. So I tried that the next day, and it was the only workshop. I've delivered like 30 workshops for that client. It was the only workshop where I got 100% excellent ratings. Like all the participants rated excellent, and I didn't even talk much in that training session. So that day I realized it's motivational interviewing. It was really powerful, and yeah, my wife's wisdom too.
Yeah. As a kind of an add-on to that, I think oftentimes people like us more as individuals the less we speak. And that goes to what you were saying earlier about how people like to talk about themselves and people like to talk. In an interaction with anyone, the less we speak, the more we tend to be liked, I find.
Absolutely,
And
100%.
people are talking about themselves, as long as they're feeling heard and you're asking those and you're validating them and you're agreeing with them. Not that we necessarily need to agree with everyone all the time, that's not what we're saying, but as long as you're validating them and making them feel heard and following up with questions and so forth, people are going to like you. And the inverse is often true as well. The more we talk, the less people tend to like us.
True. Absolutely.
So
100%.
let's kind of leave that where it is, but that's another topic of conversation that we could talk about for a long time. I wanted to kind of move on here and talk about one last major topic for today, and that is burnout. Burnout and stress, specifically. These are major contributing factors to decrements in performance, no matter what the industry or the pursuit is, right? So, because burnout and stress affect everybody, right? Elite athletes as well as business professionals. So, what practical strategies do you recommend or do you teach to manage or prevent burnout?
Prevent burnout. Interesting. So burnout is an area which I still have to delve deeper into. I still think I don't have a lot of expertise on burnout, but I felt burnt out a lot of times, and maybe I can share my experience there. If a person is burnt out, my recommendation is unconditional rest. That's it. Nothing else. But your question is not that. Your question is, how do we prevent burnout?
Or manage? Or manage? How do we prevent or manage?
Yeah.
So maybe burnout can't be prevented entirely, maybe it can be, but maybe there's a management technique, and maybe unconditional rest is a management technique. Perhaps. I'm not putting those words into your mouth, but how do we prevent or manage burnout?
I love this framework. There's a framework called Build and Broaden model by Barbara Fredrickson, if I am not wrong, in the world of positive psychology, which says that when you have positive emotions, your mind opens up and you have new ideas coming in, your mind broadens, and through those ideas, you are able to get better solutions and fix problems in life. I still am not an expert in this framework, I'm still learning, but uh, this is my understanding of the framework. It's a very, very powerful framework, which in simple terms means that we need positive emotion. And that's very, very true, because when our brain has too much negative emotion, we all know that our fight or flight is activated, our analytical thinking shuts down, our prefrontal cortex shuts down. Uh, we tend to become very task focused. We want to fix, get to a solution, and move on. Right? Fight, flight, freeze, fawn. All those four things. But if we want creativity to come in, if we want innovative, creative ideas to come in, then the mind cannot operate from fight or flight. It needs to be much more at rest, much more at peace. So, positive emotion is absolutely, absolutely necessary for human mind to thrive. And that's exactly what can be done to prevent burnout in athletes as well as in high performing corporate professionals and in a lot of other corporate professionals as well. If people are not able to generate positive emotion, then chances of them burning out speed up. And now the question comes, where do we get that positive emotion from? It can come from anywhere. It can come from genuine progress, which is the hardest way to get positive emotion. So, for example, let's say if I learn a new skill today, I practice it, I grow, I see myself developing as a human being, that positive emotion comes from growth. So, that's one way. Positive emotion can come from getting support from our loved ones. So healthy functional relationships, that's another way to get that jolt of positivity in our life. Positive emotion can come from doing activities that are a lot of fun, which we enjoy doing. So for example, I love reading. That gives me so much positivity, so I'm able to, chances of me burning out go down if I'm reading a lot. Uh, that's something that people can bank upon. But other than that, there are so many other positive psychology interventions. You can sit in grass, you can go help somebody. That gives a lot of positive emotion. We can um, we can do some meditation, and we can dance, we can sing, we can play music. So anything that generates positive emotion will have a will will prevent burnout. That's what I feel, that's what my experience is. Again, I'm not an expert in burnout, but positive emotions, I think, definitely contribute towards prevention of burnout.
Okay, so I would say probably two major takeaways from what you said there, and one of them could be if we are in a position of management, for example. Well, this goes both ways. If we're in a position of management, or as an engineer or a coach or something like that, helping our I don't know, subordinates isn't the right word, but helping our team members of one type or another prevent burnout in them is to encourage them with positivity, which again goes back to what we were talking about earlier this episode of the 80% empathy and encouragement and the 20% nudging. So that's positivity right there. That's going to help prevent burnout in your team.
Yeah.
And then seeking out positivity on our own, right? Because we can't necessarily rely on positivity from other people because we may or may not get it, and we don't
Yeah.
necessarily have control over that sometimes. So seeking out positivity on your own, whether that's meditation or journaling or participating in an enjoyable activity, reading or playing with your dog or playing video games or painting, cooking, these things that sort of have an intrinsic positive value to us, those things can help us prevent burnout as well.
Yes, absolutely. And you and I, we've talked about in the past about the book Man's Search for Meaning by Dr. Viktor Frankl. I think that book really sums it up well. Hope also is a big positive motivator. So when we have some goals in our life, we have hope to achieve those goals, that hope itself creates a lot of positive emotion. So let's say if I'm running a business and I'm hopeful that maybe in a year I'll be able to reach this target or this amount of clients and maybe this geography that I would have served, that hope itself creates a lot of positive emotion. Having goals creates a lot of positive emotion. I think that also that would be really really important. So just to sum it up, genuine progress, positive psychology interventions, and your hobbies and goals and hope to achieve that goals. Those four things I would say would really, and you don't need to have all four. Even one or two out of those four would be enough to prevent burnout.
Okay, well said. Now, as we get close to wrapping up our episode here, I wanted to ask you one final question. If our listeners could implement just one actionable tip or mindset shift, now this could be something that we've talked about already in the episode today, it could be something completely different. But if our listeners today could implement just one actionable tip or mindset shift to improve their performance, regardless of if they're an athlete, an engineer, a coach, a manager, if these people want to become their best self, what is one actionable tip or mindset shift that you would recommend for our listeners today?
Very hard for me to choose. I'm confused between scanning and marginal gains. So, marginal gains, as in picking one skill at a time and just aiming for 1% improvement, maybe in a month, but actively working on that skill and improving that 1%. So, for example, let's say I work with a lot of engineers and they have their clients across the world. So, if 1% improvement would be asking clients one open ended question in every meeting just to get to know their client better and build a better relationship. So that's just one open ended question more than they usually do. So 1% increment practiced over a month, that's really really powerful. And then you do it, let's say for 10 skills in a year, you've increased, let's say 30% or something. If that's 1% compounds over 10 times, I think it's 20-30%. So if someone's growing 30% every year, they become unstoppable in a few years. So I think that would be one. And then scanning, maybe just instead of focusing on your own technical skills, also start observing people and see what they are doing and how you can influence them.
Okay, so we'll take those two things
Yeah,
because they're
two.
both incredibly valuable. The one being scanning that we talked about earlier, whether that's physically scanning or learning information both for personal growth or learning information about your teammates, your managers, the people that report to you, just scanning in general, just acquiring information
Yeah.
basically more actively. And then the other one being marginal growth. So basically, which we could tie into growth mindset, but we won't get into the framework or definition of that necessarily. But marginal growth meaning intentionally trying to improve upon, even if it's just one thing at a time, a small amount continuously, that will have a huge impact over time on your development as a person and skills, just sort of generally speaking.
Absolutely. Very well summed up, Justin.
All right, Gagan. Well, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today. You are extremely wise. Your expertise is very well received both by myself and by our audience, I'm sure. I want to encourage you to continue to grow and succeed in your career, as I will aim to do in mine. And this episode has been insightful and informative for both of us as well as for our listeners, I'm sure. Was there anything else you wanted to add today before we wrapped up?
I think I'm extremely grateful, Justin, to you for your friendship as well as, for giving me this opportunity and being such a good listener. I really enjoyed talking in this podcast, and one of the major reasons is because you were reflecting really, really well. So I think you are a great podcast host, and I see a lot of podcasts, and I have not seen many where the host reflects a lot, asks a lot of questions, and doesn't talk too much. A lot of podcasters talk a lot. So thank you for having me. It's an absolute honor for me, and thank you for your friendship also. I'm forever grateful.
Same to you as well. Thank you, Gagandeep. I really appreciate you, and our listeners do as well. That will do it for today, folks. This was the All-Star Athlete Podcast. Thank you all for listening, and I will talk to you all in the next episode.